Today we're going to talk about my favorite word in the entire Hebrew language, what it had to do with the people in Isaiah's time period, and what it has to do with us today. So let's talk about it. Hey everybody, my name is David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest for another video walking through the Old Testament prophets, where we're hopefully going, Lord willing, all the way from the book of Isaiah to the book of Malachi, book by book, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. We're just getting started with this series, so if this is your first video, it's a great time to start with us. I hope you'll go back and watch the other ones, but if you're right here right now, let's do this. Two quick announcements before we get started. If you would like access to the slides that I am using for this series, you can access those at nowletsbehonest.com/resources or by clicking in the link in the description down below. And also, if you would like to support me on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/David Tate, or once again by clicking on the link in the description down below. I'm going to open us up in a word of prayer, and we are going to get started by talking through the book of Isaiah. Dear Lord, thank you so much for another day to get to worship you. Let us not take this day for granted, God, but let us recognize that it is an opportunity and a privilege to get to worship the God who created us, the one who gave us everything, the one who is literally in charge of the heavens and the earth, the one who was unobligated to show love to any of us, the self-existent, uncaused cause, who had no reason to show any of us any sort of love or compassion or anything, but you did and you do and you will purely because that's who you are. So let us recognize that this is a privilege that we get to worship a God like you. And let us not take that for granted, but as we go into your word, let us recognize that this is the word that you gave to us so that we can come to understand who you are more. And as we read through your word, shape us, change us, help us become more like the people that you want us to be so that we can be part of the solution that this world needs. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Okay, so this is going to be our 9th video going through the book of Isaiah, and if you've been tracking with us so far, what we've been talking about is really just a whole bunch of different stuff. For the first 12 chapters of Isaiah, Isaiah was talking specifically to the people of Judah, and he was talking about some of the things that they'd been failing at and how God was going to relate to them in regards to, or in response to what they'd been doing. Chapter 13, though, saw a transition where all of a sudden Isaiah is no longer speaking directly about the people of Judah, but instead he started speaking about the people of Babylon. And that's going to continue even into this chapter, where he's not only going to be talking about the people of Babylon, but he's going to start talking about all the different nations that surrounded the southern kingdom of Judah during that time period, and he's going to be talking about the different things that they've done wrong and the destruction that is going to come upon them because of what they've done. And we talked about this a little bit last week, but why would Isaiah share this? Because in all reality, most likely these foreign kingdoms are never going to see the words that Isaiah is writing, right? Isaiah is a prophet to the people of Judah. So why would he bother sharing all this information with the people of Judah if the people that it's actually about aren't even going to see it? Well, first off, I think he would do it because, it's the word of God. Whatever God tells him to write down, he's going to write down. But second off, I think it's because this is meant to comfort the people of Judah and make them realize that their enemies will also be destroyed. Thirdly, it also is to highlight that, God's ways are different than our ways, and God's going to do things a bit differently. And yes, the people of Judah are going to suffer from these enemies, but in the long run, God's going to watch out for them. He's still going to be with them, and he's going to overthrow those people as well. Then there's always the fourth reason, which is just to remind the people of Judah not to commit the same sins that these other people were doing. And so we're going to wrestle through all that stuff as we go through this. And I think that the temptation, whenever you get to sections like this, is to kind of just breeze through it and not pay as much attention to it, because it's not as overtly theological as we might typically like, and it doesn't necessarily have as clear application points as the tough stuff we typically are looking for when we read the Bible. But I think that is more our own fault, and that's really an issue in regards to how we typically read the Bible in a very self-focused manner. I think we need to remember that the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore every word that's in it is very, very important. And so I hope that will encourage you to just read this and recognize that God wrote this for a reason. Whether it has to do with just the people of Judah or us or whatever it's about, this is the Word of God. And so I hope that will hopefully encourage you to read this with the same amount of interest that you would read other stuff that might be more overtly applicational. But I'm still going to try to include some application points throughout this whole thing. And today we are talking about a throne of Hesed. And you might not know what the word Hesed is, but by the end of this video, I hope that you will understand it very, very clearly and very, very well. So let's hop right in. So like I said, in the past few chapters, or really last chapter and a half, we have been talking about the oracle that Isaiah was preaching against the people of Babylon. Right here, starting in verse 24, it seems like his attention is going to shift from Babylon to Assyria. We don't have the little heading like we usually do. Normally it'll say like an oracle against Babylon, an oracle against Moab, an oracle against so-and-so. We don't have that in this section, and so technically these verses right here against Assyria might still belong to the oracle against Babylon, but it is pretty clear that Isaiah is talking to Assyria, and so I put a split there, and I just put this in a separate video. But that being said, what I'm going to do, I'm going to read a few verses here, and then we're going to start breaking it down. The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. And as I have purposed, so shall it stand. That I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. And his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? And his hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? So here we can see that in these few verses right here, God turns his attention to the people of Assyria. Like I said in the last video, anytime we encounter a new nation, I'm going to have a map here that kind of shows roughly where these people were at. Borders worked a little bit differently back then than they do nowadays, but this is a rough approximation of where these people would have dwelt at this time period, and Assyria is the little pink area up at top. It's not really little, it's actually a fairly large area. And what you need to know is that Assyria was the dominant power during Isaiah's time, and God vowed to destroy them too. I mean, you can just read through these words, and you can be like, yeah, this doesn't sound very good for the Assyrian people. They were oppressing his people, Judah, at that time period, and he would deliver the people of Judah. This is what God's promise has been to them all the way back since chapter 7, right? You have the whole Emmanuel prophecy, God with us, right? God is telling the people of Judah, I am going to be with you no matter what. And so, yes, God is sending the Assyrians to go and punish Judah even at this very moment while Isaiah is preaching this. But at the same time, Isaiah is clarifying, don't worry, Assyria is going to get their own as well, right? And we even had the prophecy earlier on where it says that Assyria is going to get up to this, like, it's going to be like they're strangling the people of Judah, right? They're going to get up to the walls, they're going to lay siege on Jerusalem, but then they're going to be turned away. And so Assyria is going to destroy the northern kingdom of Israel, but they're not going to get to destroy the southern kingdom of Judah. They're going to get very close, though. But now Isaiah is saying, don't worry, Assyria is going to get their own as well. Because the Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. So right here, we just get to see the foreknowledge of God, right? I mean, he's been planning this for a long time. At the time Isaiah is saying this, Assyria is the number one power in the land, and they're attacking everybody, including the people of Judah. But at that same time period, Isaiah's like, no, God's already planned something that will come to pass. As I have purposed, so shall it stand. Exactly what God says is going to happen. So if you're the people of Judah and you're hearing this, these would be words of comfort, right? I mean, you're hearing that the people who are currently attacking you, they are going to be destroyed. God's purposes have not shifted, all because the Assyrians are getting closer and closer to Judah. That isn't to suggest that the God of Israel has failed. It just means that his plans are a little bit different than how we would typically like. Verse 25, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot, and his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. So he's saying, I'm going to kick the Assyrian out of here. They might be coming into Judah. They might be trying to destroy you. I'm going to kick them out, and I'm going to remove the yoke of their oppression from your shoulders, O my people. Emmanuel, God with us, right? God is saying, I'm going to be with you through all of this. Verse 26, this is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth. And this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. This is really kind of cool because what we see right here is that God's destruction of Assyria is simply a picture of what he will do to anyone or anybody who defies or oppresses his people, right? So Assyria is kind of just like a microcosm, right? It's a picture of what God will do to anybody who opposes his people. This is the purpose that is purposed, right? The destruction of Assyria is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth, right? So anybody who opposes God's people can expect to meet the same fate as Assyria. For a time period, God might allow them to prevail, but in the long run, God's going to wipe them out. And this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations, right? So the hand of God that is stretched out against Assyria is the same hand that is stretched out over all the nations. God is not just the God of Israel, he is the God of the entire world, but specifically the God of Judah and Israel, right? So he's going to watch out for them in particular, but he's going to help all his people by attacking and taking care of the nations who are oppressing them. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? God has purposed destruction, and what God has purposed, no man can annul. Right? We can't change his mind in this regard. There are some times where we can pray and we can change God's mind, but we cannot change his mind in regards to justice or vengeance, right? God declares, vengeance is mine. If you go to the book of Romans, that's what he says. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. And therefore, we have to realize that justice is in his hands, and there's nobody who can stop that. He will punish evil, and he will call evil what is evil. He will call good what is good, and he will lift up his people and grant them salvation. But he is going to destroy those who oppose his people. But now we shift our attention from Assyria to the people of Philistia. The people of Philistia, you can see them on the map right here. They were a people along the coast. You'll recognize the name of the Philistines. These are the people who King Saul and King David, they really opposed these people. David did a better job of doing that. The Philistines, we don't exactly know where they for sure came from. A lot of scholars kind of speculate that maybe they were the same as this other group of people known as the Sea Peoples who migrated from across the sea, which would make sense because they live on the coast. And really, the Philistines, they were just people who were living on the coast, constantly trying to take over land, and it seems like them and the Israelites went back and forth constantly. But for this time period, during Isaiah's region, they were down there kind of in the southern region of Judah, and now we're turning our attention to them. In the year that King Ahaz died, came this oracle. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying fiery serpent. And the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety. But I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Wail, O gate. Cry out, O city. Melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you. For smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people will find refuge. So once again, you see destruction being promised against the foreign nations, but hope being offered to the people of God. If you didn't catch that, let's break it down. In the year that King Ahaz died. Okay, I have a real quick note here. We don't know exactly when Ahaz died because that's one of those phrases, like whenever you actually go look at the biblical account of Ahaz's death, it seems like it's slightly ambiguous as to what exact year he died. So some people think this could be 727 BC or it could be 715 BC. There's like a 12-year gap in there. Did I do that math right? Yeah, 12-year gap where we're not totally sure which one is correct there. I might lean towards 715 BC because it's something we're going to see a little bit later, but we just don't really know, and Isaiah was ministering at both these times, so it's very likely that it's either one. But during this time period, this is what God has to say in regards to the people of Philistia. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. What God is saying here through Isaiah is that the joy of the Philistines was premature. They're told that the suffering of their enemies, not only through the death of Ahaz, but also Tiglath-Pileser III, king of Assyria, who'd also died at that time period, didn't guarantee safety because the Lord vows to judge them too. So what we see here is that the picture of the Philistines at this time period is that on one hand, King Ahaz died, right? Ahaz was one of their enemies, and so he's dead. And around this same time period, one of the mightiest kings of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser III, he had also died. And so the Philistines might be rejoicing because not only was a king of the people of God dead, but also Tiglath-Pileser III was dead. And so the Assyrians are, it seems like they're less of a threat, and then the people in the land they're living are less of a threat. the Philistines might rejoice at this. And they're like, wow, sweet. All of my enemies are falling apart. But God says, yeah, your joy is a little bit premature. Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. Don't rejoice that these people who attacked you have fallen down, that they're weakened, that they're not as powerful anymore. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. So he's saying, yeah, you might be rejoicing that these current enemies you've had died, but I'm telling you right now that the people that I'm raising up after them are going to be even worse off for you. And the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety, but I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Right? So you have this total role reversal, right? The firstborn of the poor, right? The people who don't have anything, they're going to graze and they're going to enjoy life. And the needy will lie down in safety. The people who typically didn't have a home, they'll have a bed to sleep on. But on the other hand, I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. So these enemies who are going to rise up, they're going to destroy the wealthy and the powerful in Philistia, and those who were abused and misused and ignored, they're the ones who are going to actually enjoy the land. And so the Philistines, they don't have any reason to rejoice at this time period. Verse 31, wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you. For smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks. Both Assyria and Babylon attacked Philistia from the north. Assyria and Babylon, they were kind of from the same rough region. I mean, they're kind of like right next to each other. And so Assyria and Babylon, they're both going to be attacking from the north. And that's exactly what Isaiah is alluding to here, right? Smoke comes out of the north. Uh-oh, you better watch out. This is coming. There's no straggler in his ranks. These people are not kidding around. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. Despite the Philistines' destruction, God's people can rest secure in him and in his promises. When Philistine envoys are sent throughout the land, the people of Judah will see that refuge is only found in the power of God. So right here we have the imagery of the Philistines amidst all their shock and the fact that they're about to be destroyed. They send envoys and they send messengers throughout the land. And this is what Isaiah says to the people of Judah. What will one answer the messengers of the nations? Right? So whenever the Philistines send the messengers saying, hey, we need help. What's going on? Like, how do we get out of this situation? What are you supposed to respond to these messengers? You respond this. The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. The only response is by reminding people that salvation is found only in God. You can trust in foreign nations. You can trust in your armies. You can trust in your power. You can trust in your wisdom and battle strategy. But ultimately, only those who trust in God will last. And only those who trust in God and put their faith in him will survive. Now we turn to Moab. Moab was a region east of the Dead Sea. These are the descendants of Lot. If you remember the story in Genesis chapter 19, shortly after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Very strange story, where it seems like Lot and his two daughters thought that maybe they were the last people on earth. And so what happens? Once again, weird story, not for the faint of heart. Lot's daughters get him drunk and they sleep with him. And through this become two nations. And one of those nations is the Moabites. And so that is who these people are. And so they're kind of relatives of the people of Israel, but at the same time, they were bitter enemies of them. And that's why it's so shocking when you get to the book of Ruth and you have a Moabite woman who becomes like the great-grandmother of King David. You're like, whoa, what? This is crazy. So the Moabites, not necessarily the best people. They're really, just go look into some of their history. Not great people, but that's who we turn to now. Once again, we're just cycling through all these different nations that surrounded the people of Judah. An oracle concerning Moab. Because Ed of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. He has gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep. Over Nebo and over Medeba, Moab wails. On every head is baldness, every beard is shorn. In the streets they wear sackcloth, on the housetops and in the squares everyone wails and melts in tears. Heshbon and Elealeh cry out, and their voice is heard as far as Jahaz. Therefore the armed men of Moab cry aloud, his soul trembles. My heart cries out for Moab, Her fugitives flee to Zoar, to Eglath Shalisha. That's a cool word at the end of that. Yeah, so right here, I'm going to just read the thing I have at the top here first. All the cities described here are in the northern region of Moab. As each city falls to the Assyrian invasion, the people of Judah were meant to learn the futility of trusting in foreign nations, like Moab, and the importance of trusting in the Lord. Right? So there is this representative thing going on. You'll see that there's a lot of different cities that I mentioned here you might not be familiar with, but that's because they're not cities in Judah or Israel. They're cities in Moab. And at this time period, Isaiah is saying, look at this. The Assyrians are marching in, and they're destroying city by city, going from the north, working southward. They're destroying all the cities in Moab. Do you really think you can trust in them to help you? It seems like really that's a big case that Isaiah is making against all of this, right? Because if you go back to the early chapters of Isaiah, like chapter 7, whenever he confronts King Ahaz, he's like, hey, don't trust in foreign nations. You need to trust in God. You need to trust in the fact that God is with you and that God will save you. You can't trust these other nations to help you out because they're not going to be able to do it. And now what we have in chapter 13 going forward is that Isaiah is listing out the failures of all these nations, how they're all going to be destroyed. And so maybe that's another reason that Isaiah includes this. It's to remind you, don't trust in these nations. They're going to be as easily destroyed as Assyria will be. What you need to do is trust in God, because look at who is the source of the destruction of all these nations. It's ultimately God. God is the one who's destroying them. And so you need to realize that God has the power to raise up and push down rather than these nations. These nations, they don't have that power. They will enjoy prosperity for a little bit, but if they swell in sin, God is going to punish them and destroy them as well. And so for the people of Judah, they need to learn to trust in God. And so as we go through these verses, one by one, all these cities are being destroyed. Because Ad of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Because Kir of Moab is laid waste in a night, Moab is undone. Boom! Done in an entire, just one night. Here, where this was a mighty, strong city, maybe it was walled, I don't know. Big, mighty city, and it's undone in a night. And therefore, Moab likewise is undone. In the verses after this, the Moabites are presented as going to their temples and high places, crying out to their gods for deliverance. But their gods can't save them. Even their valiant warriors are left trembling and weeping. That's what we see in verses 2 through 4 here. He has gone up to the temple and to Dibon, to the high places to weep. Over Nebo and over Medeba, Moab wails. Nebo, you might recognize that name. That's the mountain that Moses died on whenever he was looking into the promised land, right? And so they're going up to all these high places, the places where they would worship their pagan gods, and they're crying out for deliverance, but these pagan gods can't help them. And so all they do is they're worshiping in vain, and they're seeking out their god's help, but nothing's happening. And so they wail. On every head is baldness, every beard is shorn. These are signs of humility and just shame. In the streets, they wear sackcloth. On the housetops and in the squares, everyone wails and melts in tears. Heshbon and Elealeh cry out. Their voice is heard as far as Jahaz. Therefore, the armed men of Moab cry aloud. His soul trembles. This is sad imagery. I mean, even the armed men, right? The military guys, they're weeping their eyes out. They're crying like little babies because that's the destruction that's going to come on them. And as the people of Judah, you're probably hearing this and you're like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't trust in Moab to help us out. These people don't seem like they're going to be any better off. And then to make matters worse, verse 5, Isaiah himself says that my heart cries out for Moab. Her fugitives flee to Zoar, to Eglath Shalisha. So though the Moabites have mistreated God's people, and despite the fact that Moab is typically characterized as Israel's number one enemy east of the Dead Sea, Isaiah is left weeping as her fugitives flee south for their lives. So even though Moab is considered one of the greatest enemies of the people of God at this time period, even Isaiah can't help but be like, yeah, these people are going to have it rough. I weep for them. That's going to suck. It's not going to be fun. They're going to have a really rough time, and I'm not looking forward to that for them. So even Isaiah is like, yeah, I feel bad for these guys. We should feel bad because their destruction is going to be terrible because they don't have that power, right? God has the power to raise up and to push down. These people don't have that power, and they're going to have a rough time at everything. And then it continues. For at the ascent of Luhith, we can see that the oracle against Moab is a little bit longer than all the others. Not as long as Babylon's, but longer than the ones against Assyria and Philistia. For at the ascent of Luhith, they go up weeping. On the road to Horonaim, they raise the cry of destruction. The waters of Nimrim are a desolation. The grass is withered. The vegetation fails. The greenery is no more. Therefore, The abundance they have gained and what they have laid up, they carry away over the brook of the willows. For a cry has gone around the land of Moab. Her wailing reaches to Eglaim. Her wailing reaches to Bir Elim. Those kind of, you can see how they kind of rhyme. There's some wordplay going on. Yeah, so right here you see a bunch of cities that you might not necessarily be familiar with. I know I'm not, but that's why I included a map over here, because some of them are mentioned in the map. But the Moabites, who esteem themselves mighty and strong, are pictured fleeing for their lives across what is left of their destroyed homeland, carrying whatever they can with them as they flee for safety. So once again, they're just running for their lives, trying to avoid the destruction that is coming. For at the ascent of Luhith, they go up weeping. On the road to Horonaim, they raise a cry of destruction, right? So you see them ascending, you see them going down the road. The waters of Nimrim are a desolation. Everywhere they look, there's no salvation. This water can't, it's a desolation. It's dried up. The grass is withered. The vegetation fails. The greenery is no more. Everywhere they're going for some sort of solace, all they do is find destruction. Therefore, the abundance they have gained and what they have laid up, they carry away over the brook of the willows. They realize that in light of what's happening, all their prosperity has come to nothing. They had all these possessions and all these things they had gained, but now what they do is they just have to throw it in a sack and carry it with them and see if they can hold on to it for as long as they can. That's the issue with materialism, right? You have to realize that, you hear this said often, but you can't take stuff with you into heaven, and all the things that you have, even on earth, they can be taken from you in a single moment. Honestly, if you go read the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon wrestles through this for a long time, talking about how, everything you have, you might spend your entire life amassing this great fortune, and in a single day it can be lost. That's just the truth. That's how it is with materialistic focus, and that's exactly what these Moabites are experiencing, right? These people, they had so much, but all of a sudden the Assyrians are going to come in, and they have nothing anymore. The abundance they have gained and what they've laid up, they carry away over the brook of the willows. For a cry has gone around the land of Moab. Her wailing reaches to Eglaim. Her wailing reaches to Bir Elim. If you just imagine this, you'll understand how sad the imagery going on here is. You can just, if you just close your eyes for a second and just imagine this desolate waste area, right? Just a desert, and you just hear nothing but weeping ringing throughout the canyons, right? You just hear people crying all around because they've lost their homes, they've lost their families. Probably some of the young men have been killed in battle. People have been taken captive. It's just sad. It's sad imagery. And for the people of Judah, you're like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't trust in these people. They can't save themselves. Verse 9, for the waters of Dibon are full of blood. For I will bring upon Dibon even more. A lion for those of Moab who escape, for the remnant of the land. I probably should have highlighted I will bring in blue, because it seems like that's God speaking there. For God will bring upon Dibon even more, a lion for those of Moab who escape, for the remnant of the land. What you need to know about Dibon, we had it mentioned earlier in the passage as well. Dibon was the religious center of Moab, where they worship the god Chemosh. The imagery of blood flowing like a river, or filling a river, conveys a clear message: total destruction, right? Everybody's been killed, so the blood is filling up the river. Their god was incapable of saving them, and though some escape their assailants, they find danger in the wilderness as well, right? So once again, the imagery is very heavy-handed here. The waters of Dibon are full of blood. The very place that they went to pray to their gods for deliverance, those waters are now full of blood because their gods weren't able to deliver them. And I will bring upon them, Yahweh will bring upon Dibon even more, a lion for those of Moab who escape, for the remnant of the land, right? So even those who escape this massacre, even those who escape alive, they're going to go out into the wilderness, and God's going to have a lion waiting for them. There's no salvation for them. They're not going to be saved. Now we move into chapter 16. Send the lamb to the ruler of the land from Selah, by the way of the desert, to the mount of the daughter of Zion. Animals typically would often be sent by vassals as tributes to their overlords, but in this instance it seems that the people of Moab are actually pictured as arriving in the Edomite town of Selah, just south of Moab. You can actually see it at the bottom of this map. It says where Selah's at. Just south of Moab, it seems like because they're fleeing, they flee out of their own land. They go down into Edom, and they arrive in Selah, and they're actually sending tribute to Judah seeking help, right? So this kind of is consistent with what we saw before, whenever we saw with, Philistia, right? How Philistia sent messengers to Zion. Well, now in the same way, Moab is also sending messengers to Zion. So it's kind of weird how, once again, the tables have turned. In this moment, whenever Isaiah is talking to the people of Judah, they've been looking everywhere, seeking foreign people to help them out against the Assyrians. But Isaiah is saying, oh, it's going to change. Those people are going to be destroyed, and they're actually going to be coming to you for help. Because they're going to recognize that we need you to help us out. And so they're sending lambs to the ruler of Zion, right? From Selah. Here they are. They're sojourners. They're away from their land. They're fugitives. They're refugees dwelling in the land of Edom. And they send lambs to Zion, right? To Jerusalem, asking for help. Like fleeing birds, like a scattered nest, so are the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon. The Arnon, I believe, was the southern boundary of the oh no, it's not. It's in the middle of the thing. I think I was wrong there. Okay, never mind. The Arnon, you can see that it's in the middle of Moab. For some reason, I thought it was the southern boundary, but that's actually Zered, which is the southern boundary. But like fleeing birds, like a scattered nest, so are the daughters of Moab at the fords of the Arnon. So here they are in the midst of their country now, and they're fleeing, right? They're scattering abroad. That's why some of them end up down in Edom. They're just going everywhere because they have no home, because Moab will be destroyed by the Assyrians, and they're going to be asking the people of Judah for help. And so, how are the people of Judah to respond to this? Isaiah tells them, give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon. Shelter the outcast, do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. When the oppressor is no more, and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then a throne will be established in steadfast love. And on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. This is where there's a turn, right? And once again, we're going to get back to the doom and gloom destruction stuff in a second, but this right here, this is where there's a sudden turn, because all the other things we've been talking about so far have been directed against the foreign nations, right? Do this, this is what's going to happen to you. You're going to face destruction. But right here, all of a sudden, Isaiah turns his attention to the people of Judah and tells them how to respond whenever these scattered birds, right? These scattered people of Moab, whenever they send a lamb to the people of Judah and they're asking for help. How should the people of Judah respond? Now, I've already told you who the Moabites were. They were enemies of the people of Judah, and the people of Judah would be tempted to ignore them, to hate them, to not want to say anything back. But this is what Isaiah says to do to them. Give counsel, grant justice, make your shade like night at the height of noon. Think about the imagery of that. May the shadow that you give to them, may the protection you give to them be comparable to a person dwelling under such shade at noontime that it feels as if it's night. That's how much you want to protect them. Shelter the outcast. Do not reveal the fugitive. Let the outcast of Moab sojourn among you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. Despite the fact that the Moabites are deserving of their destruction, Isaiah calls the people of Judah to provide shelter and aid to the fugitives in Moab. In spite of past rivalries, they're called to be a source of refuge for those who seek help. Wow. I mean, we realize that all of a sudden, whenever Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you, he's not actually introducing a new concept. This is consistent with what God has wanted his people to do all along, right? The Moabites were the enemies, but God's saying, when they come to you for help, give them help. Be different. Don't be vindictive. Don't turn against them. Don't deny them that help, but give them counsel and grant them justice. Make your shade like night at the height of moon. Shelter the outcast. Do not reveal the fugitive. If people come looking for them, don't let them know where they're at. Protect them. Let the outcasts of Moab sojourn among you. Be a shelter to them from the destroyer. Take care of them. Here you thought that they could help you out, and you were wanting them to, but what about when they're in need? When they're in need, I want you, my people, to take care of them. And you might ask, why should they respond this way? Why should they do this? God's going to tell them that too. When the oppressor is no more and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then a throne will be established in steadfast love. And on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. Right there in those verses, in that verse and a half, God explains why the people of God are meant to be gracious to people who don't deserve it. Why are the people of Judah meant to be gracious and caring for the people of Moab who've been nothing but trouble for them all their history? But in order for us to fully understand that, I need to explain one word to you. And it's the word that I told you is my favorite word in the entire Hebrew language. So forgive me if I talk about this for a while. It's the word Hesed. Right here, it's translated as steadfast love. In other translations, you'll see it translated as very different things. But let me just read this little blurb that I wrote here. This marks our first occurrence of Hesed in the Hebrew, in the book of Isaiah. Hesed is probably one of the most important yet rarely discussed words in the Old Testament, and it is also one of the most difficult to translate words in the entire Old Testament. Different translations will translate it as loving kindness, steadfast love, kindness, mercy, etc. In his book, Inexpressible, which is devoted to trying to discern exactly what Hesed is, Michael Card, who's an awesome musician, he defines Hesed as when the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. In this instance, Isaiah is asserting that the Messiah's throne will be established by Hesed of God. Despite the fact that God's people have no right to expect anything from him, at the culmination of all things, he will give them everything he has promised. Hesed is probably the closest Old Testament equivalent to the New Testament concept of grace. There is a Hebrew word for grace that is used in the Old Testament, but it seems like whenever the New Testament uses the word grace, it's more calling back to Hesed. And like I said, this word to me it's amazing. It's an amazing word. There's a reason why people have such a difficult time translating it, and that's because there is no equivalent to it in English. There just really isn't. It seems like Hesed has this very deep theological underpinning to it, so that whenever you try to translate it to English, you almost have to give a definition just to make it understandable. And so I really like Michael Card's definition, right? When the person from whom I have a right to expect nothing gives me everything. That's what Hesed is. Whenever God reveals himself to Moses in Exodus chapter 34, he says, I am a God who is slow to anger and abounding in Hesed. He is a God who is constantly giving and giving and giving to people who don't deserve it and who have the right to expect nothing. That is how the people of God relate to him. That is probably one of the defining attributes of God, and it is the defining way by which all people relate to God. Right? We have no right to expect anything from God. And so the fact that he would even make himself known, that's Hesed. The fact that he would reach out to us, that's Hesed. The fact that he would love us, that's Hesed. The fact that he would love us even after we sinned against him, that's Hesed. The fact that he wants to dwell with us, that's Hesed. All these things are Hesed, 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 steadfast love. This is what David sings about in almost every single one of his psalms. Okay, that was probably exaggeration. He doesn't mention all of his psalms. But in a lot of them, that is one of the defining characteristics of how David recognizes his relationship with God goes. Psalm 23, surely goodness and Hesed shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever and ever. I just wrote this 30-page paper. It was a Hebrew paper for one of my Hebrew classes. I wrote a 30-page paper on Psalm 31. And if you go read that, the turning point of that psalm that takes it from lament to joy is the word Hesed. David recognizes that he is defined by God's Hesed. He has the right to expect nothing, yet God gives him everything. And that word is crucial to understanding not only how we relate to God, but how we as the people of God ought to relate to others. And that's exactly Isaiah's point right here. Why should the people of Judah treat the people of Moab so well? Because of this. When the oppressor is no more and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land, then a throne will be established in Hesed. And on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, one who judges and seeks justice and is swift to do righteousness. The motive for Judah to help Moab is the recognition that things are not as they were meant to be. But a day is coming when God will end all oppression and injustice, and the Messiah will sit on David's throne. As they await that day, Judah is meant to be a picture of that messianic kingdom, a light in the midst of the dark. As the Messiah will reign in Hesed, so Judah is to abound in Hesed. So the way that Isaiah is motivating the people of Judah to treat the people of Moab well is by reminding them that they don't deserve the Messiah that they're going to get. One day God is going to make all things right, and the Messiah is going to sit on a throne of Hesed. The fact that there is going to be a king who reigns in righteousness and justice over the people of God lets us know that God is constantly giving to people who have no right to deserve anything from him. The people of Judah were constantly rebelling against God, constantly sinning against him. He gave them their law, but they still rejected him. They still turned to foreign idols. Yet God never revoked his promise. He never turned away from it. And he's still going to establish that throne even though they don't deserve it. He's unobligated to do it. They're not deserving, yet he's going to do it. That's the definition of Hesed. And so if God is going to do that for the people of Judah, people of Judah should do that for the people of Moab. Sure, the Moabites might not deserve it, but you don't deserve what God's going to give you either. And that's why I'm saying this is my favorite word, because how true is that also for us as Christians, right? There are a lot of people around us day to day who don't deserve anything, right? I mean, they don't deserve a smile. They don't deserve a pat on the back. They don't deserve diddly squat. But the thing is, neither do we. I'm a sinner. I grew up as a sinner. I rebelled against God. I rejected him. But then, by his chesed, he has saved me. He offered me everything when I had the right to expect nothing from him. And so when Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you, he's saying, do the very same thing that I have already done. If my throne is established in Hesed, I expect my people to also abound in Hesed in the same way. If God is willing to forgive us, we ought to be willing to forgive others, not just in extreme manners, but also in the small things. If somebody does something wrong against you, why lash out at them? Choose to forgive them. We can be better. We can be different. That's what God is saying right here to the people of Judah through Isaiah. He's saying, yes, the people of Moab are going to come to you for help, and you might not want to help them because they've been jerks to you in the past, and they didn't help you when you needed it. But guess what? God helped you when you didn't deserve it, so maybe you should help the people of Moab as well. Whoa. When the oppressor is no more, and destruction has ceased, and he who tramples underfoot has vanished from the land. So Isaiah is painting this picture of the end of all days when there's no longer any pain, when there's no longer any suffering, when there's no more oppressors, when the Assyrians and the Babylonians and everybody's gone. In that day, a throne will be established in Hesed, right? There will be a man sitting on a throne, and we have no right to expect that man to be there. But because God is who he is, he's going to put that man on that throne. And on it will sit in faithfulness in the tent of David, right? The descendant of David, Jesus Christ. One who judges and seeks justice and who is swift to do righteousness. We don't deserve a Messiah who will judge and who will seek justice and who will do righteousness because we don't deserve anything other than to be judged and to be the ones who face the justice and be the ones who have to endure the righteous punishment of God. But instead, as the people of God, we are going to get to see the Messiah doing all these things. And therefore, Isaiah is saying, do the same to others. If God has done this for you, show that same amount of love to others. If God was willing to reach out to you at your lowest moment when you rejected him, do the same to others. That is Isaiah's point right here. That's why I wanted to spend so much time on this, because it's so crucial to our understanding of who God is and how we relate to him. But let's move on. We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is of his arrogance, his pride, and his insolence, and his idle boasting. He is not right. Therefore, let Moab wail for Moab. Let everyone wail. Mourn utterly stricken for the raisin cakes of Kir Hareseth. Here we learn that the sin of Moab was, like those of Assyria and Babylon, pride. This seems to be a big issue for everybody who becomes a little big for their own britches, right? Whenever you experience prosperity, whenever you experience power of some sort, typically we tend to succumb to pride. The same is true of Moab. For the fields of Heshbon languish, and the vine of Sibmah. The lords of the nations have struck down its branches, which reached to Jazer and strayed to the desert. Its shoots spread abroad and passed over the sea. So once again, to subjugate the pride of Moab, you have these foreign generals coming in, the foreign lords of the lands. They're coming in and they're absolutely laying this place to waste. Therefore I weep with the weeping of Jazer, for the vine of Sibmah. I drench you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh, for over your summer fruit and your harvest the shout has ceased. Earlier we got to see this imagery of the people of Moab going throughout the land weeping and wailing. But now Isaiah sees that the shouting has ceased. Everybody has died. And Isaiah weeps with them. Part of this weeping might be because the people of Judah won't show them Hesed. And even though he's commanding them to do so, they're not going to do it. And so the people who sought refuge, they die, which is sad. I don't know if that's necessarily what Isaiah is speaking of here, but I would say that that's probably pretty consistent. Again, though Isaiah knows that Moab is deserving of this judgment, and though he has every reason to hate them because of their history with the people of God, he weeps on behalf of them because Isaiah is being a faithful man of God. Isaiah is not going to tell people to do that which he isn't already doing. So he says, show them Hesed. And he's showing them Hesed. He says, I weep for you. That's another thing we need to learn as Christians. I've talked about this in the past. All because people are evil doesn't mean we should rejoice in their destruction. We should rejoice in God's justice being performed, and we should rejoice in the judgment of God. But that's not necessarily the same as rejoicing in the destruction of an evil person. I don't think we should do that. I remember, maybe I've shared this before, I don't know, in these videos, but seeing videos whenever Ted Bundy faced the electric chair, it's really sad to me. Because in that moment, justice was done. Ted Bundy was a vile man who justly faced the death penalty. But at that time period, there were a bunch of people stationed outside the place where he was killed. And if you can go look up the videos here on YouTube, and you can see how people reacted that day. And a lot of them claimed to be Christians, and they were rejoicing in Ted Bundy's death. And that made me kind of sad, because I think right there, there's an issue. You should rejoice in the fact that justice was performed. You should rejoice in the fact that evil was ridded. But I don't think we should ever rejoice in a person's death. Because I think that's different. Because death comes from sin, right? And so if we're rejoicing in this thing that resulted from sin, I think that's kind of messed up. And so yes, we should rejoice in the justice. We should rejoice in the just judgment. But we shouldn't rejoice in the actual death itself. And that just made me sad because I saw a bunch of people claiming to be Christians who were hooping and hollering at Ted Bundy's death. And it's like, and they weren't doing it because of the justice. They were making fun of him and mocking him. And I think that's sad. And I think Isaiah would agree with that, because right here, the Moabites are terrible. But he weeps for them. I weep with the weeping of Jazer. So he's weeping alongside them. For the vine of Seba, I drench you with my tears. This isn't just like one little stray tear. He's drenching them with tears. For over your summer fruit and your harvest, the shout has ceased. They've stopped singing. They stop crying. And joy and gladness are taken away from the fruitful field, and in the vineyards no songs are sung. No cheers are raised. No treader treads out wine in the presses. I have put an end to the shouting. Therefore my inner parts moan like a lyre for Moab, and my inmost self for Kir Hareseth. It's sad. Like, you can feel the weight of what Isaiah is saying here. Because, yes, the Moabites were bad. Yes, they were no good. Yes, they were the enemies of the people of God. But he weeps for them. He weeps at their destruction. Because you know what? There were probably somewhat decent people in Moab. There were probably somewhat innocent people. There were probably children and women who were going to be destroyed. The celebrations and singings and joy of the harvest would not take place, for the people of Moab would be laid to waste. This is a sad, sobering description that should cause the reader to reflect deeply on the sorrow that comes from sin. It reminds me also, if you go to the book of Judges, you see a similar case. Shortly after Deborah destroys some of the people that she was going against, there's this guy named Sisera, who was the general of the army she was fighting. And she sings this song. I believe it's Judges chapter 5. And in Judges 5, she sings this song. And the song is rejoicing in the victory that God's given. But at the end of the song, there's this sobering moment where she sings about Sisera's mother, who is waiting at the window of her house, constantly looking over the hills, waiting for her son to return. And Deborah reflects on the fact that Sisera is never going to return. And the mother in the song, she thinks, oh, well, maybe it's because he's having such victory that he is, maybe he's just taking a really long time to plunder everybody and get back home. But Deborah's like, no, he's dead. And the mom's going to have to face that. And so I like that the Bible it really wrestles through that, right? Like, yes, God is just, and there is just judgment, and this is righteous wrath of God being poured out on these people with the Assyrians attacking Moab. But at the same time, we shouldn't rejoice in their destruction as much as we should rejoice in the justice that was performed through their destruction. Because we do have to face the reality that this is very sad moments, and I like that the Bible doesn't sugarcoat that. And that's why it really bothers me whenever people try to claim that the Old Testament God was bad. Because the Old Testament God, he acknowledges that this is severe and it's sad and it's horrific. But at the same time, he knows that it's just and it's righteous, that it's done. And so I think that when we actually read the Old Testament, we see that this God is compassionate and loving. And even though these people have been constantly wailing on his people, on the people of Judah, God still cares for them. And he still wants them to, he wants them to repent. He wants them to come to him. That was the whole point of establishing the people of Israel, right? He gave them a law so they'd be holy and so that the nations would come to him. But the nations are in rebellion and they're not coming to him. And so he's going to judge them. But as a result, a lot of sad stuff's going to happen. And so Isaiah is weeping because he says, this blows. I mean, you have women and children and men, everybody's dying because they have rejected God. And I like that the Bible doesn't sugarcoat that. I like that the Bible doesn't try to paint this like it's a happy thing. The Bible recognizes, yeah, it's the sad reality that people are sinners and they're going to face destruction. Moab is just one example of that. And when Moab presents himself, when he wearies himself on the high place, when he comes to his sanctuary to pray, he will not prevail. Moab, wearied by their futile efforts to cry out to their gods, will recognize that their gods can do nothing to save them. It's sad. Like, there's just really no other way to describe this other than it's just sad. Even in their final efforts, they're once again climbing the slopes of Dibon to go cry out to their gods, but they're not going to prevail. Right? The gods can't help them. The only God that could help them is the people, is the God of Israel. And they sought help from the people of Judah, but apparently they're not going to help them. This is the word that the Lord spoke concerning Moab in the past. But now the Lord has spoken, saying, in 3 years, like the years of a hired worker, the glory of Moab will be brought into contempt in spite of all his great multitude, and those who remain will be very few and feeble. This is language that we're going to see that Isaiah uses again, specifically the years of a hired worker. The imagery is that he's using precision right here. Like a hired worker, they know exactly how much time they've been working, right? And so there's precision in what he's saying here. Moab was promised 3 years until her glory was taken away. In 715 BC, the Assyrian king Sargon attacked Arabia, and it was likely during this time that Moab was severely degraded and humbled. However, Isaiah promises that a remnant will be preserved. So not everybody will die. He says that those who remain will be very few and feeble. They're going to be weak, but they're still going to be breathing. And so, very sad reality that's going to have to be faced by the people of Moab in the end. Now we go to chapter 17, and we're going to do these last 14 verses, and these are directed against the people of Syria and against the people of Israel. An oracle concerning Damascus, with Damascus being the capital of Aram/Syria, just two names for the same place, because of the anti-Assyrian coalition figureheaded by Syria, which we've talked about in past weeks. Tiglath-Pileser III invaded Syria and destroyed Damascus in 732 BC. This lets us know that the oracles found in chapters 13 through 23 aren't necessarily organized chronologically, right? Because some of them are taking place later. It just seems like they're organized differently. I don't really know why they're organized the way they are, but this would have been delivered probably a lot earlier than the prophecy against Moab. An oracle concerning Damascus. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Aroer are deserted. They will be for flocks, which will lie down, and none will make them afraid. The fortress will disappear from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus. And the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. And in that day the glory of Jacob will be brought low, and the fat of his flesh will grow lean. And it shall be as when the reaper gathers standing grain, and his arm harvests the ears, and as when one gleans the ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Okay, let's walk through it. Once again, destruction, destruction, destruction. Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city, and will become a heap of ruins. Once again, destruction, destruction, destruction. The cities of Aroer are deserted. Aroer mark the southern boundary of Syria along the Arnon River. This is what I was getting that stuff confused earlier. Arnon River is the southern thing, and it was also the northern boundary of Moab, right? So where Syria and Moab met, that's the Arnon River. And so Damascus, we got that up in the north. We got Aroer down in the south. The whole place is going to be destroyed and deserted. The cities of Aroer will be deserted. They will be for flocks, which will lie down and none will make them afraid, right? If you know anything about sheep, you know that they are skittish and they are scaredy cats. Yet Isaiah says that there's not going to be anybody dwelling there to scare them, right? They're just going to be dwelling in peace because Damascus and all of Syria will just be destroyed. The fortress will disappear from Ephraim and the kingdom from Damascus. And the remnant of Syria will be like the glory of the children of Israel, declares the Lord of hosts. This is even sadder. Because here we have the people of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. They are introduced into this picture as joining in the negative consequences of what Syria is going to experience. And this is all because Israel allied with Syria against Judah. If you remember that back in the earlier chapters, whenever Isaiah confronted Ahaz, it was about this anti-Assyrian coalition that Syria and Ephraim, or Israel, they had kind of gotten together and they had gone to Judah for help. But when Judah denied them that help, they decided to turn against Judah. And so because of this, Israel, the northern kingdom, is going to be punished right alongside Syria, and God promises to take away both of their glory. And in that day the glory of Jacob will be brought low, and the fat of his flesh will grow lean, and it shall be as when the reaper gathers standing grain, and his arm harvests the ears, and as when one gleans the ears of grain in the valley of Rephaim. Just as only a few stalks of grain remain standing after the harvest, so too will Damascus and Israel be reduced to a remnant after Assyria comes for them. The people of Judah would grasp this imagery, for the valley of Rephaim was a fertile valley near Jerusalem. I was actually reading about Rephaim just a few hours ago, because I've been in Genesis chapter 14, and we talked about them there. Not that that's important to this lesson, but now there's a little fun fact about what I've been doing in my life. So just like there's only a few stalks of grain standing after harvest, that's basically what Israel and Syria are being compared to after God is done with them. Gleanings will be left in it, and as when an olive tree is beaten, 2 or 3 berries in the top of the highest bough, 4 or 5 on the branches of a fruit tree, declares the Lord God of Israel. Just as 2 or 3 olives at the top of a tree might escape the notice of the harvesters, so too there might be a few lucky people in Israel who avoid God's judgment. And this is kind of the imagery that you're going with on both sides, both in verse 5 and verse 6, both with the harvest imagery, like both in the grain fields and also with the tree. It's the idea that, yeah, there might be still some stalks of grain left. There might still be some olives like hanging there that the gardener missed. But it's more like you just lucky chance, right? That's kind of the imagery that Isaiah seems to be going for here, right? So yeah, God's going to destroy Syria and he's going to destroy Israel. And those who survive, it's just because they happen to miss the judgment of God. And obviously, it's not saying that, like, obviously we know that God is in charge of everything and he's not just going to miss somebody. But that's the imagery that Isaiah is going for, right? It's like, oh, you were lucky. We know that God's in charge of everything. There's really no such thing as luck. But from Isaiah's perspective, that's what he's trying to get across, right? It's almost like the gardener just accidentally overlooked them. And really, they should have been destroyed alongside them. So you should just rejoice in the fact that the gardener didn't see you, and that the harvester missed you, and that the gleaner just accidentally didn't chop you down. But you should have been, and if he'd noticed you, you would have been. Whereas in reality, God is just being gracious to them. In that day, man will look to his Maker, and his eyes will look on the Holy One of Israel. He will not look to the altars, the work of his hands, and he will not look on that which his own fingers have made, either the Asherim or the altars of incense. This is a really happy thing, but also kind of a really sad thing, because we see that the judgment will be so severe that the people of Israel will finally be drawn to repentance. And rather than looking towards their rituals or idols for their aid, they will at long last turn to God. But at the same time, at what cost? Like, why did it take till this? Right? The northern kingdom of Israel, they belonged to the people of God, right? You have the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. They were a united kingdom for a while, right? The united monarchy under David and Solomon and Saul, all of them, they were united. The people of Israel, they knew who God was. But for some reason, they rejected him and turned to idols. The people of Judah do the same thing. And it's just really sad when you read this, because you're like, why did it take this long? Why do you have to be laid to waste? Why does there have to be just nothing but a remnant left for you to finally turn to God? Like, shouldn't you have just recognized that that's what you were supposed to do to begin with? But at the same time, we do the same thing, right? I mean, we forget God all the time. We turn from him all the time. So it's kind of hard for us to look with judgment upon these people whenever we're guilty of the same thing. In that day, their strong cities will be like deserted places of the wooded heights and the hilltops, which they deserted because of the children of Israel, and there will be desolation. So even the strongest cities, even the biggest cities in Israel, they're going to be deserted. That's going to be what happens whenever the people of Assyria take them captive. They're going to be gone. There's going to be nobody there. Here they were in all their pomp and power, and they thought that they had the freedom to do all these things, but in the end, they're just captives in a foreign land, calling out to a God who said that you should have repented earlier. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants, and sow the vine branch of a stranger, though you make them grow on the day that you plant them, and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. I have this highlighted in purple, even though it seems like Isaiah is talking to the people of Israel rather than the people of Judah, but he's speaking to them as the people of God, because the people of Israel are still the people of God. And so he's speaking to them in that way, and so I still highlighted it because I think it is still getting across Isaiah's point here, and I think it's got a really good preaching point for us. Here we learn that the sin of Israel, the northern kingdom, was that they have forgotten their God. Instead of seeking God for help from Assyria, they have turned to Assyria for help, and though their alliance was carefully taken care of and nurtured, it will end in their destruction. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, right? Who delivered you from Egypt? Who delivered you from the Philistines under David? Who delivered you from all these things? It was God, Yahweh, the God of Israel. And you've not remembered the rock of your refuge. Who was your solid foundation? It was the God of Israel. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants, and sow the vine branch of a stranger, though you make them grow on the day that you plant them, and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. So God says, yeah, right now you might be tending to this beautiful harvest. You might be allying yourself with Syria, and things might be going great. But in the end, the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. So sure, your alliance with Syria is going fine, but guess what? Assyria is going to destroy both of y'all. You should have trusted in me. And that's what God is saying here. And so, whenever we're talking about how to apply this, I'd go look at the top of verse 10. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation. We'll see multiple times that God will reference the people of Ephraim or Israel as Jacob. And it seems like when he does that, it's because he's calling them back to who they were at the beginning, right? Because Jacob, his name was eventually changed to Israel. And from him came the 12 tribes of Israel and all that stuff, 10 of which comprise the people of Ephraim or the northern kingdom of Israel. And so whenever he calls them Jacob, he's reminding them where they came from, because God is the one who made them into who they were, right? God is the one who appeared to Jacob at Bethel, that resulted in Jacob saying, wow, surely God was in this place and I did not know it. And then God appeared to him again at Peniel and wrestled with him and changed his name to Israel. And so whenever God calls them Jacob, he's saying, hey, remember where you came from. Remember who I am to you. Why have you forgotten me? Why have you forgot the God of your salvation? And that's what he says right here. You have forgotten the God of your salvation. And so, when it comes to application, I would ask you, as a friend, and as the person listening to this video, have you forgotten God? Right? Because I think a lot of the times we do forget him. I know I forget him all the time. Sadly, I mean, I work in ministry. And I think that forgetting goes a lot deeper than just like not remembering him at all. I think the idea is that you're not living a life that's consistent with knowing that he's there. I mean, the people of Israel, they probably worshipped Yahweh. They probably just didn't worship only him. They probably worshipped a mixture. They probably worshipped Yahweh, Baal, Ashtaroth, Asherah, like all of them. They probably worshipped just all the different pagan gods, whichever one suited them at the moment. And so I would ask you, have you forgotten the God of your salvation? Who is the one who gave you life? Who is the one who knit you together in your mother's womb? Who is the one who saved you? Who is the one who has been with you all throughout your life? Have you forgotten him? Because if so, we might have to face this sort of discipline for God to get us back, and I hope we would just repent while we have the chance, rather than facing what Israel had to face. For you have forgotten the God of your salvation, and have not remembered the rock of your refuge. Therefore, though you plant pleasant plants, and sow the vine branch of a stranger, though you make them grow on the day that you plant them, and make them blossom in the morning that you sow, yet the harvest will flee away in a day of grief and incurable pain. So for us, I would say, hey, maybe you've stopped trusting in God with all you are. And maybe you've started putting your trust in other things. You know, maybe you've started putting a little too much trust in your finances. Maybe you've put a little bit too much trust in worldly relationships that you develop. Maybe you've put a little too much trust in your intellect and your abilities, in the things that you take for granted in life that could be taken away. Well, that's exactly what the people of Israel did. They put their trust in the people of Syria, and it didn't help them out. In the end, the harvest fled away, and they were met by a day of grief and incurable pain. And I don't want us to face that. I would rather us right here, right now, repent and turn to God. And so I think there is room to apply this very important truth here. Just because, I don't know, the stuff that Israel went through is really sad. They had to be destroyed before they came back to God. I don't wish that upon you. I wish that hopefully you would turn to God before he had to discipline you in that sort of degree. The thunders of many peoples, they thunder like the thundering of the sea. The roar of nations, they roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. Chased like the chaff on the mountains before the wind, and whirling dust before the storm. At evening time, behold, terror. Before morning, they are no more. This is the portion of those who loot us, and the lot of those who plunder us. I think these are the final words of comfort that Isaiah wants to speak to the people of Judah that kind of closes out this little section right here. Though God is using these foreign nations as his hand of judgment and discipline against Israel and against Judah, these people are not aware that they are being used to accomplish his holy purposes. They are acting from the evil of their hearts. Isaiah comforts Judah and Israel by reminding them that God is going to judge these people to a much more severe degree for opposing the people of God. So yes, Israel will be judged. Judah also will be judged. But the nations that are judging them will be judged even more. And so God will be faithful to his people. God is still with them. And one day a throne will be established in steadfast love, in loving kindness, in mercy, in kindness, in Hesed. Right? That throne will be established. God will reign upon it. The Messiah will reign upon it, because plot twist, spoiler alert, the Messiah will be God in the flesh. And that's the amazing truth here. And so, yes, there are thunders of many peoples, and the thunders like the thundering of the sea. Yes, the roar of nations is coming, like the roar of many waters. But God will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. Those nations that are coming after Israel and Syria and Judah, eventually they're going to be destroyed as well. They're going to flee far away, chased like the chaff on the mountains before the wind. They're going to be running for dear life. And we're actually going to see that with Assyria. Assyria is going to surround Judah, and they're going to be fleeing. And whirling dust before the storm. At evening time, behold terror. Before morning, they are no more. At evening, they're going to be scared. And by the morning time, before they wake, they're going to be gone. Because that's how quickly God can work. The people you feared with all your heart can be destroyed in a single moment, because God's the one in charge. And so I think the message to the people of Judah is that we need to trust in God more than we trust in everything around us. Right? Here we think that the Moabites will help us. They won't be able to. We think Syria or Israel might be able to help us. They won't be able to. We might think the Philistines could help us. They won't be able to. We might think that Assyria themselves might just stop. They're not going to. Assyria is going to be coming, and they're going to be destroyed. The Philistines, the Moabites, Syria, Israel, they're going to be destroyed as well. What we have to do is we have to trust in God, who can take Assyria and overnight can destroy them. This is the portion of those who loot us and the lot of those who plunder us. This is what is facing everybody who opposes the people of God. If you oppose the people of Judah, you're going to be destroyed. And so, what should you do? Trust in God. Look forward to the throne that will be established in Hesed. And right here in this moment, live your life according to that promise. That throne will be established. And so trust in God and live in light of his character. And as he will reign in Hesed, so we should abound in Hesed in this life. And we should be constantly giving things to those people who have no right to expect anything from us. And in that way, we will be replicating the future kingdom of God, and we'll be foreshadowing it in our lives right here, right now. Next week, we're going to be going through Isaiah chapters 18 through 20, and we will be talking about something that I have titled The Egyptian Messiah. And if you want to know what that's all about, come back next week, and we will be sure to talk about it. Until then, my name is David Tate. Thank you so much for watching this video. Once again, if you want access to these slides, you can get those at nowletsbehonest.com/resources. And if you want to support me on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/David Tate. Or you can just go click on the links in the descriptions down below, which might be a little bit easier. Thank you so much for doing this with me. I really appreciate y'all. I will check y'all next time. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. God bless.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.